I don't know, Shadi, I'm pretty excited about this episode.
Oh, you are?
I am.
Well,
yeah, tell me about it.
Well, I'm glad to hear that because, dear listeners, and we do have a special episode for you. It was almost epic, I would say. I think it's probably the longest we've ever done, and I'll say more about that in a second. But we are joined by the author, Mustafa Akyol. It's an incredibly rich episode, I would say. Many of you might know Mustafa. He's a contributing opinion writer for the New York Times, senior fellow at the Cato Institute, author of several books, including his new one, which is called Reopening Muslim Minds, A Return to Reason, Freedom, and Tolerance. Very good book. The cool thing, though, is that he's also a good friend.
Yeah.
And on some issues, we're on opposite sides.
Well, you guys are. I'm just a listener in here, but yeah, definitely.
Yeah. So the great thing about this episode is I think we wanted to explore why we're sometimes on opposite sides, why and how we diverge on key issues. We debated all things Islam, liberalism, how to interpret Islamic law in a modern context, whether religion can be rationalized, and one of Damir's favorite issues, which is an important one, whether ideas precede action or the other way around.
Yeah. And just also to add, while the book is very much about Islam, the questions about liberalism and about the role of faith in societies, I think makes this one of these very, very timely and excellent episodes.
Exactly. Yeah. And because the episode was so epic, if I can use that word, it reached almost 2 hours. And so what we decided to do was divide it into two parts. Part one is available to everyone, to all of you. And the second hour will be for subscribers only.
That's right.
So we would encourage you, if you're interested, to subscribe by going to wisdomofcrowds.live/subscribe. We'll also include a link in the show notes if you just want to click on that. And not only will you get members-only episodes every week, you'll have access to all our paid content, which includes a weekly column called the Friday Essay, where Damir and I alternate each week. So it's an exciting time for Wisdom of Crowds. So we hope you'll consider joining us and being part of the community. And I suppose now to the main attraction, our conversation with Mustafa Akyol. Enjoy.
No, Mustafa, I did read a very big chunk of it, and Shadi and I actually were discussing it this morning about how to structure our conversation. But the truth is, we never structure these things, and after talking about it for for about 5 or so minutes, we realized, especially having a friend on like this, even though an important and famous friend with an important book, I think it's just best that we sort of see where the conversation takes us. I think it's an incredibly rich book, and I certainly have some specific first order questions for you, but I know that Shadi also, has questions about Islam and things more specific than I can possibly even contribute to the conversation. So I think it'll be very rich. But I don't know, maybe we can start by just telling us, you can tell us, the beginning of the book has a I think a very compelling introductory story about part of maybe the impetus for writing the book. But maybe you can just tell our audience a little bit as an intro, what got you basically to take on this project.
Thank you, Damir, and thank you, Shadi. And I really look forward to hearing what you think about the book. And I'm glad that you had a chance to see it before this conversation. This book was written in 2 years, but it was built in 2 decades, maybe 3, I can say, in the sense that this book is the culmination of all the issues of Islam and politics and public life and freedom and human rights that I've been struggling with and dealing with and contemplating about, first in my home country, Turkey, then, now recently more in the United States. And I do think I'm saying something here kind of ambitious, and I'm saying, hey, listen, dear fellow Muslims, dear Ummah, we have a problem. We've come to a dead end, as I put it in the epilogue, with our current epistemology and the way we think about religion. And again, not the whole Muslim world, but a big part of it. And we have to rethink some issues really deeply. And to illustrate what I say, I begin with a personal story. As you said, Damir, in the beginning, the introduction chapter, A Night with the Religion Police, tells the story of how I was arrested in Malaysia in September 2017 by the religion police after me delivering a public lecture in Kuala Lumpur arguing for religious freedom. In that lecture, I had criticized the ban on apostasy, or ridda, as it is called in Arabic. Whether it's exactly translated as apostasy or not is a good question, but I will not get in there now. Basically, can a Muslim publicly say, I'm not a Muslim anymore, I lost my faith, now I'm a Christian, or I'm an atheist, or some other persuasion? Can a Muslim say that safely in a Muslim majority society and just walk away without any legal prosecution? Well, the answer to that is no. In about a dozen Muslim majority societies, in Saudi Arabia or Iran especially, you'll certainly get arrested. You might be given the death penalty, which is generally evaded, but you'll be in certainly jail. And in Malaysia, Malaysians are proudly moderate, so that's cool. But that's why they don't send them to prisons, apostates, but they send them to rehabilitation centers. And I argued against that as well. And I said, as a Muslim, I don't want to see people, leaving my faith, but if that happens, we cannot coerce that. And of course, I made several religious arguments there, which is just not coming from me per se, but I relied on expert scholars, some clerics. One of them is Rashid Ghanouchi, by the way, who has a very, I think, important view on this, a more progressive view. And so I said, religion cannot be policed. And then the religion police arrested me. And I tell the story of that event. Then I highlight that to make my case, which is, I believe the Islamic civilization has to take a step forward in terms of giving up coercive power in the name of religion. This has taken place in Christianity with the Enlightenment, beginning with thinkers like John Locke or Pierre Bayle and others in the early Enlightenment period. Christianity reinterpreted itself to give up practices like the Inquisition or burning heretics at the stake. And those practices were actually more brutal and more intolerant than what we had in the Islamic world at the time. But that has taken place in Christianity, and I think it's been a good transformation for Christianity itself and for the rest of the world. In mainstream Islamic thought, we haven't fully accomplished that. And I think that's necessary because that's bringing the Islamic world to a crisis of religion. In many Muslim societies, there are forces, Islamists or regimes, who want to uphold the coercive understanding of Islam. There are people who are alarmed about that, so-called secularists, and that leads to endless political disputes and struggles, and Islamist groups compete with each other. There's a lot of bloodshed in the name of Islam. And what I emphasize also there is that this is not even related or limited to the groups we call typically extremists, terrorists like ISIS or Al-Qaeda. I emphasize that they are really, really extreme. So they don't really define the whole Muslim world, not at all. They actually attack fellow Muslims, and they are a very marginal force, although they're a big problem. I'm saying even in mainstream Sunni or Shia understanding of Islam, there needs to be a reckoning with certain issues of human rights and liberty. Now, when I say this, of course, I know many things will come and people will say, oh, why are we buying into this Western nonsense? Isn't this a colonialist idea? Why can't everybody has their own values? And so I get into a lot of discussion in the book about whether we need to think universally or we need to buy into some moral relativism. So that opens a lot of questions about theology and philosophy in Islam. But, let's get to that together, if you will.
Yeah. So, Mustafa, I also want to just tell our listeners that you should really buy this book. And I know that I say that when other people who have books come on, and I kind of mean it for them too, but in this case, I really do mean it. I even texted Mustafa last night while I was reading it, and I was like, damn, this is incredible. And the great thing about having a friend on the show is that we can also push back, because as it turns out, I like the book a lot, but I also have big disagreements with some of the starting premises. And I think that's what I think will make this conversation really interesting. And I'll be curious to see how it goes. But, first thing, readers, check the book out. It's called Reopening Muslim Minds. And of course, we'll include the links in the show notes and all that. And Mustafa, I guess and we've actually been sort of on opposite sides when people put us to debate each other at different events. It's always very friendly, which is great, but we do have different views on this. So I think we can start to maybe unpack where some of those divergences are. But, as I was telling you before we came on, I mean, one thing I liked a lot about the book is that you talk in a lot of detail, which could otherwise in someone else's hands be kind of dense or boring or exhausting. These stories about early Islamic history, which are somewhat specialized, and you really bring them to life. And at some points, it almost felt like a thriller. I was like, I know some of the background, but there were new details, and I'm like, what's going to happen next? And that takes a very special kind of writer. So, so with all that, let's get into some of the meat. I think.
Yes, sure. I look forward to hearing those too. But thanks for this gig for the book, and thanks for your kind words about it. I'm glad you liked it, enjoyed it, and I know. I mean, I since you're a proponent of illiberal democracy, as I would quote it, I would like to hear your disagreements, which I kind of can guess, but maybe I don't. So I would love to hear more.
Okay,
sure.
To be fair though, I don't know if I'd call myself a proponent of illiberal democracy.
A defender of illiberal democracy.
Damir. I mean, look.
Okay, I'm putting a strong word here. Okay, I was half jokingly, but
yeah, I know.
I think you are more lenient than me towards this phenomenon that is called, rightly in my belief, illiberal democracy.
Definitely, that's true. Yeah.
And I think it's fair to say I prioritize liberalism in the classical sense of the word, in terms of human rights, individual rights, and you seem to prioritize the democratic process. Which is another view, and we have certain disagreements there.
Exactly, yeah.
But this book is not just about that. I mean, but there are aspects of books that might be touching upon that a little bit, right?
Yeah. Well, why don't we start with that? The question of the commitment to classical liberalism, and obviously, one thing you're trying to do is to look back into the Islamic tradition and finding precedents for not necessarily liberalism, because that word didn't really exist then, but a kind of more humanistic and open and broad-minded approach to Islam and Islamic law. And those are actually part of the tradition. They've just been submerged. And you talk about a particular group in the early centuries of Islam, the Mu'tazilites, who are in some sense, rationalists, although that we can get back to what being rational really means. But these are people who saw independent reason as a legitimate venue for finding the truth, that it wasn't only revelation that could lead a Muslim or anyone else really to the truth. And in that sense, reason and revelation were not in tension. They could both lead to the same ultimate good. But on that, I mean, one concern I have with the kind of retrospective reformist approaches to Islam, where you have more liberal leaning scholars and authors like yourself today who are, in some sense, sometimes I get the sense that they've decided what their conclusions are. They think liberalism is good, and they think that a stronger emphasis on reason, freedom, and tolerance is good. So then they take those conclusions and they basically re-engineer the process, and they go back into the very dense, rich, and complicated context of the Islamic legal tradition, and they find what supports their preconceived conclusions because they know what they want. If liberalism, classical liberalism, is in fact the goal, then you can find what you want in Islamic history that leads you closer to that goal. So maybe let's just start with that, because I think that is one of the criticisms that is, I think, understandably lobbed against people who are trying to liberalize, let's say, aspects of the Islamic tradition. How would you respond to that?
Well, Shadi, I would respond by saying that you're right. That's what I'm exactly doing, and I'm proudly doing that. And I also justify the way I do it. Because I do argue that intuitively we humans can make moral judgments about certain institutions in society. So I mean, let's give up this all abstract talk about liberalism. I'll give you a concrete example, which I actually examine in the book. You might have seen that part. Abolition of slavery. I think one of the great things that happened in human history, especially in the past few centuries, was the abolition of slavery. And where did it happen? It began in England and France, and they started to promote this idea. By the way, they were colonialists, which is another, part of this discussion, which is the grim side of the Western history, of course. But they began to promote this idea. U.S. did catch up pretty late, as we all know, because of the slavery in the South, which was very brutal. And ultimately, that idea of abolition of slavery came to the Islamic world from the West. And some Muslims said, what is this nonsense? I mean, we don't need to have anything learned from the infidels. And they didn't buy into it because slavery was in the sharia. But it was possible. Slavery was abolished after long battles and struggles in the Muslim world, a lot of debates. There was the impact of Western liberalism, but also Islamic liberalism, because a lot of Muslims, when they heard the idea about abolishing slavery and everybody should be free, they actually looked back into the scripture. They looked back into the Quran, and they saw verses about freeing a neck as a moral duty. And they said, yes, we see the roots of this in our scripture. So that is the kind of approach which I find helpful today in other human rights issues. Today, Muslim liberals, Islamic liberals, people like me, we look back into the Quran and we find the verse, La ikraha fid din, or no compulsion in religion. We say, yes, there's a basis for religious freedom. Although we know that traditional interpretations didn't give that much credit to that verse, didn't really uphold that verse in that sense. So I believe human values change over time, evolve over time. Today, we live in a world where Hindus are not burning their wives after death. That was a tradition called sati. It was a horrible thing. Slavery is at least legally abolished all across the world, and these are gains. And I don't buy into the argument that saying nothing is universal and every culture is good in itself. I rather believe Muslims can learn. And I make the theological argument for that. That's the important thing. I mean, this is not just, I also show that in Islam, I mean, you refer to the Mu'tazilites. If you will, let me explain what I mean by why do I emphasize the Mu'tazilites in a second. People who are familiar with Islamic theology, history of Islamic thought, when you mention the Mu'tazilites, some of them can say, oh, but Mu'tazilites were oppressive too. And they can refer to the short period called Mihna, where their ideology was imposed by the state, which is something I severely criticize. But Mu'tazilites, and of course the philosophers, people like Ibn Rushd, were important, I think, in early Islam, because on this big division that I call the Euthyphro dilemma, they took the universalist view. In other words, they said moral values, good and bad, ethical values, can be discerned by human reason, even if there is no religion. This had two implications. First of all, this means Muslims could learn from other people. They could read Aristotle and learn his moral philosophy and get something out of that, which they did. And this meant that outside of the sharia, that is religious law, there is also an ethical realm from which you can look back at the sharia and offer its reinterpretation. And in the book, I show especially how Ibn Rushd articulated that in some of his writings that are little known today, actually, among Muslims, let alone among others. So yes, I mean, I'm doing what you're exactly telling me. I am convinced by some values that are called liberal values in the West. I see them in the Quran. I see a value in not forcing people to be religious, or forcing them to be not religious, by the way, too. I see a value in allowing Muslim women to wear the hijab or not wear the hijab. And yes, I look back into the Islamic tradition and I try to find jurisprudential or theological roots which will allow me to make that argument.
But I think that, okay, so on slavery, to be against slavery doesn't require being a classical liberal. I mean, you can, and most Muslims now, almost all of them oppose slavery without being liberals. So I think there are ways to get to these better outcomes without a specific resort to liberal ideas. But I suppose the bigger concern is if you've decided, if you've already decided that liberalism is the best approach, that's fine. But the problem is other people could take your similar approach and say, hey, I believe in a different modern ideology, and I'm going to look back into the Islamic tradition or the Quran and try to find precedents. And that way I'll have support for what I want to do. It creates a kind of intellectual chaos because anyone can use the same methodology to kind of look back, and sometimes it can lead to cherry picking. It's not always very consistent. You find the arguments that are perhaps most amenable to your positions. I mean, if you were born in a different context, and there's reasons, Mustafa, I guess, that you became liberal. I also consider myself a liberal, but one who's more critical of liberalism, let's say. I wouldn't have been a liberal if I wasn't born and raised in the US. I mean, we're all products of our context, and you had a particular experience in Turkey where you saw the dangers of religious overreach, and that helped contribute to your evolution, if that's a fair assessment. So a lot of these things are sort of context dependent.
Exactly, but what's wrong with that? And like, what is, of course, exactly. And that's what I'm saying in the book. What I'm saying is this. I think Islam was articulated in the classical era with a certain jurisprudence and a certain theological paradigm. And actually, it was more diverse, but a certain theological paradigm dominated the scene, and it left behind a certain jurisprudence, which was contextual. Like, Muslims had apostasy laws and blasphemy laws, and nobody in the world 1,000 years ago would criticize the lack of free speech in the Muslim world. Though that value didn't exist. Muslims were actually often more tolerant than the Christian or other empires at the time. When you look at Byzantine or Sassanid empires, they have very similar approaches to religion. They have similar apostasy or blasphemy laws. But the world has changed, and I think the mainstream Islamic tradition articulated in a certain context isn't relevant, and not all aspects of it isn't relevant today. So I believe in reinterpretation. And of course, others will agree, others will disagree. This is how things change. So I don't see what wrong is there, me offering a liberal rereading of Islamic sources where other Muslims are saying, no, we'll not buy into that. But that's fine. That's how civilizations make progress. That's why diversity of opinion is a good thing.
But it does mean that your reinterpretation has a built-in incentive, because you want, I mean, by definition, as a liberal, you want to see liberal things in your religion because you're also a believing Muslim.
Yes, but I'm saying the traditional interpretation had that built-in incentive, and that was imperialism. So it's not that there is this context-free, pristine, supra-historical Islam, which is already perfectly articulated back there with all the pious scholars, without any political incentive, any context, or any culture. And then some crazy liberals come 14th century later and say, nah, let's change it. No, what I'm saying is that the Islamic tradition we have at hand already has a lot of human input in it. I'm saying the certain verses of the Quran were abrogated, rendered ineffective, and these were the verses of the Quran that actually can allow us live peacefully with non-Muslims today with toleration and freedom. They were abrogated, and that happened not because it was a divine blueprint, but because the Umayyad Empire wanted to expand its imperialistic domain, and it needed interpretations like that. So yes, I'm conscious that I'm making a liberal rereading of Islam, but I'm saying what we have in the Islamic tradition is an illiberal reading of Islam. Given in that particular context, it's not sacred.
Just to jump in here, because I think that the what's really interesting about your book, Mustafa, and what Shadi was saying earlier, it's very rich, and for someone who is absolutely not versed in the intellectual and theological discussions, the tradition, it's a great read, and it's accessible, though incredibly rich, and takes you down these paths. What struck me as generally a non-religious gadfly reading these sorts of things, I mean, even in this discussion that you guys are having, is the question of what are we talking about when we talk about liberalism? And I feel like maybe that's one way we could pull on a string here and maybe get to some interesting places. I guess what strikes me is that on the one hand, Mustafa, your liberalism is basically a request for a certain kind of tolerance. And you're reading that tolerance into the theological debates and the philosophy behind Islam going back a ways. And, when we talk about liberalism, even all the debates that are going around right now in the United States about liberalism and the Catholic integralists who feel like, Patrick Deneen and people like that who think that there's a sort of some kind of poison pill in the entire ideology of liberalism, as they might want to put it, that is sort of unraveling our societies. I think they're wrong, because I think that the kind of way that a minimalist liberalism, which I think at some points you are espousing, is this idea of just basically tolerance. And what's interesting to me about when you think about liberalism of tolerance is that it's kind of like a superset of any other sort of thing. I think that the mistake that the illiberals are making when they make these sorts of arguments is to juxtapose liberalism to, a kind of a set of religious beliefs, and then you sort of have it out between the two, and as a dichotomy, it leads to this kind of polarization. But if you take a minimal subset of liberalism and say liberalism is at its minimum toleration, a lot of this stuff ends up going away. So I throw that out there for the two of you as you're having this discussion, but maybe to push you a little bit, Mustafa, I think on one level, your book is a request for a reinterpretation to bring in tolerance. But underlying that is something else, which is I do think you have a sense of the existence of positive rights here, which I think that if there is a criticism from the illiberal side, is that the set of positive rights within liberalism are very expansive and do end up therefore being in real tension with other sorts of sets of values, I say, that various religions give voice to. So I don't know, can you maybe does that make sense as a question? Can you maybe talk a little bit about your commitments to a set of positive rights beyond toleration, and how you maybe start teasing that apart about what is key in liberalism that you would like to come into Islam, and what parts you think, you can sort of, leave by the wayside. I guess what I'm saying is what makes you anything more than a truly expansive modern liberal, where it sort of slides into its own sort of, I don't know, is that fair to say, but a religious ideology, if you will?
Damir, thanks so much for representing the secular realm in the wisdom of crowds. And that's secularism is sometimes an arbiter, and that's good, between people who have different religious views. And I'm just joking, but thanks. That's a great question. I mean, first of all, yes, this is very good. First of all, I should say in my book, I actually don't speak about liberalism too much. I mean, I'm not really writing about. I mean, I have a few allusions to John Locke, and maybe in one paragraph you can read about Adam Smith and Kant, but my book is about the Islamic civilization, Islamic tradition, but I'm showing that certain doctrines have allowed liberalism, like the idea of a natural law, allowed liberalism to flourish in early modern Europe, whereas the idea of a natural law remained on the margins of Islamic thought. And what that means is a big question. Of course, we can get into that. But let me say one thing. The word liberalism is so loaded and means a lot of different things. I come from the other side of the Atlantic. And in Turkey, when we meant by liberalism, we always meant what people call classical liberalism. In the US, I see that liberalism is a kind of a more center-left political ideology. Of course, a lot of people say, no, there is liberalism with a small l, or there's liberalism in a broad framework. That's what I'm talking about. And again, I'm not doctrinaire there. I'm not a blind proponent of any political ideology, but I do see great value in a few themes, a few ideas that I think liberalism has championed in the past few centuries. And liberalism itself, by the way, outgrew some of its early Eurocentric biases, for example. Like, what are these ideas? Freedom of religion, freedom of speech, and equality before the law. Like, everybody has the same rights before the law. People can speak out their mind unless they're calling for violence. And people have freedom of religion. They can practice. They can wear a niqab. They can wear hijab, or they can wear a miniskirt, or they can be atheist, and that's their choice. Now, are these? To me, this is the sum total of liberalism I'm speaking about, and I do believe these values are conscientiously good, and also it's good for flourishing of society. No wonder many Muslims escape to liberal societies from the oppressive regimes that they are suffering from, under which they're suffering. So I look into these values. When we speak about religious freedom, does Islam allow religious freedom? Does Islam have religious freedom? If you asked this question 5 centuries ago, again, it would be a bizarre question, because the right question would be, does Christianity have religious freedom? Because Christians were actually much less tolerant. That's why Jews were fleeing from Europe to the Ottoman Empire to find freedom and safety. But tables have been overturned, and religious freedom, I think, advanced in the Western society. This doesn't mean that everything in Western society is good. I also see liberalism evolving into different meanings. I see something called woke leftism in the US that is, challenging liberalism. Liberalism itself has a lot of different interpretations. So my book is not about that. My book is really about, you put well, Dami, toleration, but toleration based on equal rights. Not toleration in the sense that Muslims are superior rulers and they're tolerating Jews and Christians and others as second-class citizens, which was the classical Islamic model, which was not bad for its time, but I think humanity has come to better standards. Basically, I do believe that there is some moral progress in history. It doesn't mean that everything new is good. It doesn't mean that every new idea is wonderful, but there is some moral progress. And I'm asking where we Muslims stand vis-a-vis that progress. And I think the example of slavery is just a stark example that I discuss in the book, because it helps elucidate what we're talking about here.
Damir hates moral progress.
No,
you're triggering him now.
You're not. I'd love to actually talk more about that, because that to me is one of those things that is interesting, and I think is one of the most again for an outsider, if you will, reading your book is the part that got me really grappling with it. Is you set it up as I think it's like chapter 3 or something like that, is the Islam's Euthyphro paradox, or the
Euthyphro dilemma.
The dilemma, the Euthyphro dilemma, which is a reference to a famous Platonic dialogue, and it's the crux of it being the question of piety. And if I remember correctly, Euthyphros has something along the lines of he's prosecuting his father for the murder of a slave or something like that, and he claims it's a pious act. Socrates asks him, what is piety? Euthyphro says something along the lines of, piety is that which is dear to the gods. And Socrates challenges him, is it that the gods, is it pious just because the gods like it? Or is it piety in and of itself something good, and the gods therefore like it because it's good? And so, it is a fascinating dilemma, and I think it's a great jumping off point for your book. But, I've been reading Plato recently. I'm part of this reading group that Shadi and I are in, and the great thing about specifically how Socrates approaches these things, and a lot has grown out of this. But the question of Plato's forms, this idea of the good, has never been terribly satisfying to me, and in the sense that, and maybe this is part of where Shadi is coming at the question of the importance of I forget how you characterize it, the sort of top-down approach to religion, that where, truth comes from religion itself and not from rational discourse, and not from the individual's ability to perceive it. I've always had trouble with even in the Republic, where the whole discussion is about the concept of justice. I'm not sure that you really end up in a place where you can say, I understand what justice is. And even in Euthyphro, you get to this point where, I think it's a great dilemma, but it's not really clear even where piety comes in. And then, even in your chapter, you then jump off and talk about Abraham's dilemma and God demanding that he kill his son. And that's, again, even within the Western tradition, the Christian tradition, that this is a source of embarrassment, that in fact it gets at exactly that problem of faith versus reason going forward. So I don't know, it's on the question of slavery, for example, and it's the broader question I have for you again is you seem to have a very strong sense that the role of ideas plays a progressive, I don't know what, has a progressive impact on history somehow. But the question of slavery is a very complicated one, and not least of which in the United States, I think there's a very compelling case to be made that there's a very non-ideological and actually very pragmatic and economy-based and less uplifting story about why the Civil War happened. Obviously, abolitionists were true believers, but in retrospect, abolitionists have come to represent the whole meaning of the American Civil War and the abolition of slavery, when in fact it was much dirtier and much more complicated, and economics played a big role, and it was a power struggle, and it's complicated basically. So to me, that tempers the idea of moral progress. It's true what you say, that over time, we have developed perhaps a global kind of taboo against slavery. I don't mean to completely dismiss that, but I still recoil at the idea of kind of it being moral progress. So I don't know, maybe talk a little bit about the how you see the role of ideas, and maybe even the role of your book as a sort of convincing and moving the ball forward. How do you envision this impacting and moving I don't know, history forwards?
And maybe just to add to that, Mustafa, do ideas precede action, or is it the other way around? I mean, this is obviously a fundamental question that Damir and I have been debating. Damir, I think, is more skeptical about the causal power of ideas on their own. I mean, I think one of the main differences in your and I's perspective is that I think the biggest problem in the Muslim world isn't bad ideas or bad theology, but bad politics and bad political institutions. And if we address that, then better ideas, whatever those might be, will follow. And I think your sequencing is a little bit different.
Indeed. But, we've come to a very interesting point, because I both disagree with you in slight ways and very interesting terms. So let me try to address what Damir said. I mean, I'm not, first of all, saying something about the U.S. Civil War. I mean, how the U.S. Civil War was fought. Slavery was, of course, one important theme. I'm not a historian of the U.S. Civil War at all. But I do see that the abolition of slavery, especially spearheaded by the pious, believing, idealistic abolitionists, had some moral content to it. Just like today, Amnesty International cares about people who are tortured in the prisons of Sisi or, Mohammed bin Salman or Iran or whomever. So I think there is some idealism in world history, which does lead to change. Of course, it's always in interaction with material conditions, with economic norms. But by and large, I'm not a materialist, but an idealist. So I don't think in terms of Karl Marx, but maybe more like Max Weber. I do believe ideas influence the world. As a Muslim, I believe that. And as a Muslim, I also believe, yes, there was moral progress in history, and Islam was one of the harbingers of that. I mean, we Muslims are typically proud that before Islam, in the Jahiliyyah, in the polytheistic ignorance era, some Arabs were burying their newborn infants, female infants, burying them alive because they were not useless. And Islam brought humanity. It brought a more humane view of the human person to Arabia. So that's something I'm proud of. So I'm not going to say this is not moral progress. Or imagine there were cultures who were committing human sacrifice. And actually, one of the contributions of the Abrahamic era in human history, some people will tell you that, well, Abrahamists replaced human sacrifice with sacrifice of an animal. So that was as we see in the Abrahamic story. And some people will say that's actually the point in the Abrahamic story. So again, these are huge questions. We can disagree, but by and large, I do believe that there is some moral progress in human history. I believe my religion, Islam, has contributed to it, but it sometimes comes from other sources. And I think in Islam, we need to take another moral step forward towards freedom and toleration. Shadi, coming back to your question, which is, I think, the fundamental, not disagreement, but nuance between you and me on whether political problems in the world, Muslim world, are more dominant or problems about the understanding of religion. I'm certainly with you on the critique of the authoritarian regimes especially the Middle East. And I don't buy into those who think that, if Mohammed bin Salman allows Muslim women to drive freely, Saudi Arabia has become liberal, quote unquote, although he kills journalists and who criticize them or puts them in jail. So that is not what I'm talking about here. But two things on top of that. I don't think political authoritarianism in the Middle East is irrelevant or separate from the religious, quote unquote, the problematic interpretations of Islam, the religious issue. Because all the autocratic rulers, they rely on clerics who will say to the people, obeying the ruler is your duty, and they will refer to some hadith in Sahih Bukhari or Sahih Muslim. So there is a interpretation of Islam that is very useful to authoritarian power. And maybe you might have noticed this in the book. I actually criticize that heavily in its medieval forms. And I allude to the way it's being used in places like Saudi Arabia today. And secondly, the second thing I'll tell you is that look at Pakistan. Pakistan is not an authoritarian regime in the sense that there's no democracy. No, governments come and go. I mean, the military is always there, so that's a big problem. But it's not that you have a heavily authoritarian regime in Pakistan, but you have another problem. You have militant Islamist groups who want to kill people for blasphemy. And if the government doesn't do that, they will force the government to do that, which shows that besides political authoritarianism, there is the problem, what I call religious illiberalism. Of course, you can say that is that society, it's their nature, it's their culture, and everything is relative. But I wouldn't say that because I care about the Ahmadis or the Shiites or the Christians who are really targeted by that sort of militarism. And that's in Pakistan, that's everywhere. And I don't think these two issues are, although they are separate somehow, they are not unrelated.
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, so one thing on that, and this gets us to the question of Islamist movements like the Muslim Brotherhood. You didn't really talk much about the Brotherhood. There were a couple mentions, but I think one, and this isn't a huge thing, but I think it's an interesting divergence that we have, which is when you were describing the Mu'tazilites and this more rationalistic approach to the Islamic tradition, and that word was used as it should be, because that does describe some of these earlier strains in Islamic history. When you were describing them, I thought to myself, it's actually groups like the Brotherhood that are doing pretty much what the old rationalists used to do. So when you say that the anti-rationalist approach is now what's dominating Muslim majority countries, you may be right, like on some popular level, but if we talk specifically about Islamist movements. I would say this is somewhat counterintuitive because when people hear the word Islamist, they automatically assume backwards, traditional, going back to the source only, anti-modernist, so on and so forth. It happens to be the case that I'm going through some of the Islamic thinkers of the early 20th century to kind of track this for the book that I'm working on. And it's interesting. So to take one example, Rashid Rida, not to go into details about him, but he was one of the precursors of the Muslim Brotherhood and was one of the most influential figures in terms of guiding the Muslim Brotherhood's emerging ideology. And his position was that if divine revelation is in conflict with clear-cut rational evidence, then reason and rationality take precedence, and the revealed text has to be interpreted allegorically. And I compared that to what you had written in your book about the early rationalists, and it's precisely the same approach. And I think there's a limit to how much I can push this argument that Islamists are basically rationalists. But I think there is a lot to that. They're not very tied to the classical tradition. They say go back to the time of the Prophet and to the founding moment of Islam and forget all of this, a lot of the stuff that happened in between, because that's when Islam became stagnant. And they wanted to basically modernize Islam in the 20th century and make it practical and relevant. And that's why groups like the Brotherhood are dominated by engineers, doctors, lawyers, teachers, bureaucrats, technocrats, because they wanted to make Islam into a hands-on, practical religion that could hold its own against the West, basically. So I'm curious how you would sort of respond to that, or if you disagree with my characterization.
And Mustafa, before you even jump in there, this also gets to, that question of overarching liberalism, whether it's, best described as just tolerance, because I think the implied thing of like a truly, tolerant, call it overarching liberalism that has space for pluralism of religion is that the public sphere is in fact secularized, at least to a large extent. And maybe that's part of where Shadi's pushing you here, is how much, what would you like to see in the public sphere as far as like delimiting, I guess the role of a religion or how you even see that?
Two huge questions. So let me get to one. Damir, let me begin with your point, because then I'll love to go back towards Shadi, and I think it can go better like that. Father Newhouse, Richard Newhouse, who was a great thinker on public life and religion, he passed away several years ago, American Catholic priest. He had this book, The Naked Public Square, and he was criticizing the secularists in the US, or they're certainly stronger in France, who don't want to see any religious symbol or argument in the public square. I'm certainly not on the same page with those people. I think that's illiberal. But Father Newhouse was saying the alternative to that can be the sacred public square, where religion dominates public life, and it's hard to argue against that. He was saying the right ideal is the civil public square, where religion, irreligion, all kind of public views, all kind of views, worldviews, philosophies, ways of life can be there. And of course, you have to manage this because it's not easy. But I think it's more healthy because it's a kind of model where you wouldn't have the oppression in one way or the other. That's why I value classical liberalism, even some libertarian approaches on these issues, which will allow people to be who they are without being coerced by the state towards any direction, towards being more religious or less religious. And that's precisely because of that I'm very critical of the so-called liberalism in France. They don't even call it liberalism, they call it laïcité, but which I find illiberal in terms of banning the headscarf or trying to limit the religious visibility in the public square. Now, Shadi, coming back to your position, I mean, I basically agree with you that at least Islamism is a big spectrum. And for example, in the book, I quote approvingly Ghannouchi and Rashid Ghannouchi of Tunisia. And he's the leader of Ennahda, who's now maybe a post-Islamist party, but it's been the main dominant party of the Islamist movement in Tunisia. Islamism is a spectrum, and I do value Rashid Rida, who's actually quoted in my book, and of course his teacher, Muhammad Abduh, who were actually the first modernists in Islam. Today I would have ideas that are maybe more quote unquote advanced than especially Rashid Rida, but I think they brought certain worldview, and yes, they emphasize rationality more than what was emphasized before them in the mainstream Sunni tradition. Again, this is a spectrum. I mean, no Muslim will say reason doesn't mean anything. Even the Salafis will tell you that you need reason to be Muslim because you need fahm, you need to understand the word of God. But can reason independently of religion establish a political system, and that system could be good or not? Well, you have different views, and I see a spectrum there. But I do agree with you, Shadi, that Islamists should not be seen as one monolithic, problematic group. And the most rigid, religiously rigid views are coming from not mostly from the political Islamists, but from the Salafis, who represent the more far-right, ultra-Orthodox, edge of the Sunni spectrum. One more thing. I don't know if you noticed that, but I mentioned Hassan al-Hudaybi and his book, Preachers Not Judges.
Yeah, exactly. I know.
Yeah, I mean, I show there that there was a split in the Muslim Brotherhood in the, let's say, 60s. And because one faction of the Muslim Brotherhood was tilted towards Sayyid Qutb, who obviously was, on the one hand, rationalist because he was an ideologue, but he was very much against universalism because he rejected everything that is outside of Islam as a source of value. And he was, of course, he opened the way, which ultimately led to violent action, violent jihad. But Hassan al-Hudaybi wrote this book, Preachers Not Judges, saying we are preachers but not judges. And I show how he had something to do with the Murjia theology, which is another important theme in my book. I mean, I don't always speak about the Mu'tazila. I speak about these different strains in early Islamic thought. And in Mu'tazila, I find the emphasis on reason important, which, by the way, echoed in mainstream Sunni Islam through Maturidism too. And that's why I think it's not about going back to Muslims becoming Mu'tazila. That's not going to happen, and that doesn't have to happen. But to understand that we had a diversity of views in early Islam. And from the Murjia, which are so-called the postponers, I see a basis for toleration and to preach the faith, but not to impose it, which is what Hassan al-Hudaybi, the leader of the Muslim Brotherhood in the 60s, was actually speaking about.
But doesn't this, and I'm glad you also mentioned the Murjia, so postponement, and, listeners will know that I talk about the postponement of judgment quite a bit, which has important precedents in Christian thought and theology, but also as we're seeing here in Islam. But I mean, doesn't it complicate the argument a little bit if it turns out that many Islamists are rationalists and you quote them approvingly, some of them in your book? If they come to power, they're not going to promote the liberalism that you prefer. That would take some of these societies in a, let's say, a somewhat different direction. I think that's fair to say, which is just to say that rationality and reason are somewhat in the eye of the beholder. Even if we take more seriously these principles, they can lead to either more conservative or strict Islamic outcomes, and they can also lead us to more progressive or even liberal outcomes. So even if we follow your path that you're proposing, it doesn't necessarily lead to what you seem to really want in the end.
Well, Shadi, rationalism doesn't necessarily lead to liberalism. It can lead you to Marxism. It led some people to fascism. And I mean, there was a logic to fascism. It was a flawed one, but by rational arguments, you can also come up with a authoritarian political model of many sorts. Actually, So the thing is, the emphasis on reason is about whether we can reinterpret the sharia. I mean, I quoted Wael Hallaq. I mean, I think you've been reading his book lately, and on my chapter about the sharia, there are clear injunctions in the Quran and the Sunnah, and of course, the Sunnah, whether how much we have for the hadiths or not, that's a huge issue. I'm not getting there. But, there are sayings narrated or alleged sayings of the Prophet Muhammad, huge hadith collection, and then there are the words of the Quran. To me, when I emphasize reason, what I want to get there is how much room we Muslims in the 21st century have today to reinterpret these injunctions. For example, on the issue of, I discussed corporal punishments. I don't know if you've seen that part, but yes, the Quran gives chopping of hands as a punishment to theft. But I say, well, so one way of seeing is this is the divine commandment, so you have to obey this. So this is the divine commandment theory that comes from one edge of or one horn of the Euthyphro dilemma. But another way of saying this is that let's look into the context of this. Oh, pre-Islamic Arabs were doing the exact same thing. So maybe the Quranic legislation had something to do with context. And maybe we can today, since we live in a very different world, we can look into the intention, but we can punish theft by sending people to prison maybe, and not necessarily through using corporal punishment. So that is the reason element. How much room do we have to reinterpret the Sharia? When you come to about a political system, I prefer liberalism, and in the rational realm, you need a discussion about liberalism. What about the Islamists? Your question was originally about that. Well, again, which Islamists? I'm not alarmed by Ennahda at all, which is Tunisia's Islamist party. And actually, I see Tunisia as a model. And thanks to their rationalism and pragmatism, Ennahda has been able to make a secular constitution, the most liberal constitution probably ever in the Arab world, that Turkey has never been able to do. So I'm not alarmed by the Islamism of Rashid al-Ghannouchi and Tunisia, which is actually growingly becoming a Muslim democratic position, a post-Islamist one. But when you speak of Islamists, what about Hizb ut-Tahrir? Well, Hizb ut-Tahrir are Islamists. They will say democracy is kufr. They will say we need a global caliphate. So that's the other end of the spectrum. So I agree with you that Islamists should not be seen as one monolithic group. I certainly am very much against certain kind of Islamists. Others, I believe, do have a potential in advancing freedom or democracy or human rights in the Muslim world. And I emphasize reason precisely as a realm on which we can have these discussions in the Muslim world.
Can you guys talk a little bit about again? Consider me an engaged listener and out of my depth, but talk a little bit more about, because what I think is interesting about this last back and forth between you two is the question of the state and how that is shaped by political parties and what red lines are. So I don't know the specifics of how Tunisia after the Arab Spring has developed and how the constitution works. Mustafa, maybe you can walk us through it, and then Shadi, tell us where you think, is it too liberal? Or is there a space where it could be less liberal? I know sometimes, Shadi, you come on the side of more majoritarianism being okay. Does the Tunisian constitution have excessive protections for minority positions? Is it, I guess walk me through that, because that seems to me part of the debate between you two is the state. And I know, Mustafa, your book is not about that, but I think it's coming out in this discussion a little bit. So I don't know, maybe that's a way to jump into that.
Well, that's a good way to get into the perennial discussion between me and Shadi on whether democracy comes first or human rights comes first. I examined the Tunisian constitution, I think in 2013, if I'm not wrong, when it was drafted. So, I know it honors Islam as the state religion, but it has strong guarantees for individual rights and minority rights, and it doesn't introduce the Sharia as a source of legislation. To my mind, the ideal place of Sharia in the modern world is the place of halakha in the modern world. Orthodox Jews live by the halakha, by their own choice as individuals and communities, but they don't aspire for a halakhic state. Even if they do, some people do in Israel, but that's a small minority. And I think that should be the role of Sharia in Muslim Muslim life, religious life. Of course, the Sharia can also be an inspiration for justice, a sense of rights above the ruler. So it can be a philosophy of justice, which I also very much find important. But so Tunisian constitution, in that sense, to me, when I looked at it, I'll look at it again. I mean, for a broader assessment, was a very important step forward, and it was an important step forward also because precisely it was not a majoritarian constitution that we saw in Egypt when and ultimately triggered the bloody military coup of 2013, or the majoritarian constitution of Tayyip Erdogan in Turkey, which passed a few years ago, which again, let's say huge constitutional amendment, which was again majoritarian. It was only one party and its allies versus the others. Tunisians have been able to do it with broad national consensus, and I think it was an important achievement. Of course, Tunisia has huge problems today, from economy to some people longing for the old regime. I know those things, but I think it showed that Islamism can be in the political system and it can come to a consensus with the secularists. That's how I read it, but I don't know how Shadi reads it.
Yeah, well, Mustafa, I'm glad you mentioned the point about how your ideal place for Sharia is comparable to the place of halakha in Jewish contexts, and that's where I think I'll bring up a bigger issue that I get the sense in your book, and it's not just a sense. I think you say this outright, that Christianity and Judaism, even somewhat belatedly, I mean, Islam, as you mention and emphasize, was ahead as a civilization early on, but then things changed. But that Christianity and Judaism were able to make their peace with, first, independent reason as a source for finding the truth, and not just revelation, but also this led to, over time, a Jewish enlightenment and also a Christian enlightenment, which ended up reducing Christianity's role in public life. But if that is in fact the goal that you see for Islam and Muslims, I think it raises perhaps the most fundamental question, that if Islam becomes like Christianity and Judaism and follows their path, then it ends up being less distinctive. It ends up being like the other two monotheistic religions, which is maybe what some people want. They would want to see that convergence because they think that the Enlightenment was the best thing that could have happened to both Christianity and Judaism. But others would say that this would basically render the Islamic idea null and void. It would essentially dilute the Islamic content of Islam so thoroughly that it would be something other than what it always has been. And then it will cease to have the kind of appeal, which I think it does have until this day, which is that it isn't like the other religions. It is, quote unquote, more aggressive. It is more resistant to secularization. It is more, let's say, in your face, to use a pejorative term, but it's more present in people's lives, and sometimes that can be a little bit overbearing. But in any case, there seems to be broad support among Muslim majority populations for Islam continuing to play this central role in public life and politics. But what you're suggesting would lead to a very different outcome, if you see it to its logical conclusion, which is just Muslims doing their thing, and it's not really as much present in public life. There's a liberal constitution, a liberal political system. People do what they will. And I think that's the real implication. And I don't know if that's something that a lot of Muslims, maybe you and I, maybe not as much, I actually want maybe some of those things. You certainly want most of those things or all of those things. But that's what the implication is.
Well, Shadi, first of all, yes, I very much argue that what has happened in Christianity with the Enlightenment, with the early Enlightenment, let's say the John Locke path, is exactly what we need in Islam. And in Judaism, Moses Mendelssohn is the historic figure there, which introduced or initiated the process called the Haskalah, the Jewish Enlightenment, which allowed Jews to be come out of their, let's say, strong communalism and be equal members in European society. Unfortunately, that was derailed horrifically because of fascism and Nazism, anti-Semitism in Europe, and that is actually one threat I see for the future of the world. Again, that being repeated this time against Muslims in the West. So there's no guarantee that the future will be better. But yes, I basically do have references to the Jewish Enlightenment and the Christian Enlightenment, and I see a gain there. Now, is Islam a more attractive religion because it hasn't gone through these processes? Well, let's see. I mean, is Islam an attractive religion because we have blasphemy laws and every month somebody gets killed or jailed in Pakistan because supposedly they blaspheme against Prophet Muhammad? Sometimes they're just Shiites and they supposedly blasphemed against the Sahaba. They just have different opinions about the Sahaba. I mean, is Islam a more attractive religion because apostasy is a crime? And not just even real apostates, but Muslim intellectuals who have different views can be jailed, threatened. They have to flee their country to Europe. I don't think so. And I'd rather think these coercive measures that I discuss in my book, and again, I am only criticizing the coercive measures, Shadi. I'm not saying that Muslims should not be pious and they should not care about their religion. That's not what I'm saying at all. I'm just speaking about the coercive measures in the Sharia that leads to social illiberalism. And now, if we keep those things, Islam will be more attractive and will be more proud, some people as Muslims. Well, probably that obviously makes some people happy, but I see something else, which was never considered by our classical ulama, which is these measures actually are leading to the greatest wave of apostasy in the history of the Islamic civilization. There's a huge number of ex-Muslims. In Turkey, there's a huge rise of deism. There are so many Turkish youngsters. I don't know the numbers. There's no poll, but that's the talk of the day. They are saying, I'm not a Muslim anymore. I'm a deist. I'm giving up on Islam. Why? Because they're fed up with all the ugliness they see in the name of Islam. And in Turkey, again, that ugliness is from the Turkish context, which is still quite mild and modest compared to those other things. It is leading to Islamophobia. So you can be an illiberal religion when the whole world is illiberal, and probably that's fine. But if you are the only illiberal religion, or at least you are the only one compared to your Abrahamic sisters, you will have unprecedented problems of losing your believers, attracting attention, and people looking at you and not seeing any ethical values that should inspire them, which is what I believe Islam should be about, but rather something horrific that they should escape from.
Well, that's a wrap for round one. Hope you all enjoyed it as much as we did. We still have a lot more that we discussed with Mustafa Akyol. So we hope you'll consider joining us for part 2, which is available for subscribers. If you want to subscribe, you can do that by going to wisdomofcrowds.live/subscribe. We hope you'll consider joining us for the second hour, where our debate with Mustafa Akyol continues, and we delve even deeper into the big questions, and we know you want to hear the answers. So we hope you'll join us for that. Bye-bye.